Jessica said, I'm Nate, and my title here is Researcher 2. And today I will be talking about how to identify a high quality potting media, what to look for in one, what ingredients that contains, and at what ratios. And then I'll also just provide some kind of general container gardening tips. And I just want to say before I get started, if you have any questions or comments, don't understand a term I use, just feel free to interrupt me. So, brief outline of what I'll be covering. First I'll start with why it's so important to choose a high quality potting mix for your containers. And I'll talk about what they contain, what those need to do. And then I'll do a little brand comparison of different brands you can find at the store. And I'll move on to how to make a media fit your specific needs that you may have for your containers. And then cover some tips for healthy containers and end with a little summary. So you're probably wondering, why is it so important to choose the proper growing media? Like, yes, you know that there's hundreds of different products on the shelf, but aren't they all the same or at least very similar? Like they all say potting mix, right? But they are not similar. They vary greatly in the different ingredients they use and the ratios of those ingredients. And just because a product is very expensive does not necessarily mean that it is that higher of a quality than maybe a middle of the road product. And of course, just like everything, each media will have its own pros and cons, so you need to pick one that kind of matches up with your goals and what you are looking to get out of the media. So the media directly affects the rate of growth in the roots, and so that's why it's so important, because the root system of the plant is going to affect the health of the rest of the plant. And so, pictured here, you can see it's cherry tomatoes planted into two different medias, and the media on the left is superior to the media on the right. So allowed the tomato plants to have a healthier root system, and therefore better above ground biomass as well. And then finally, there's both sterilized and unsterilized products on the market, and you might be able to get by with a cheaper unsterilized mix, or find a cheaper unsterilized mix, and you probably don't want to do that because it's just going to cause you problems later on down the road with diseases. And another option you can have with potting mixes, why they're important is that some will contain additional mycorrhizae or microbes. Mycorrhizae are beneficial fungi that promote root growth and nutrient uptake in the plant. And of course, how easy it is to work with and maintain. That's another important reason. The weight of the material is a factor, whether it's very heavy. That's probably not something you want, because you want to be able to move your container if necessary, and you also don't want it so light that it's just going to blow over in the wind. And we know the wind likes to blow here in Morris. Another factor is how quickly they dry out. Some medias will dry out very quickly, and some won't really dry out at all. And so kind of want the middle of the road product there, and vice versa, how easily they absorb water again after they've dried out. Some might reabsorb quickly, and others you have to have quite a bit more patience with. So, what do you need from the media? What is the media's purpose? And that is to optimize water, oxygen, and nutrient availability throughout the container. And to do this, the media must be loose enough that water and air can freely move throughout the whole container. Water needs to be able to drain through, and the media also needs to allow for oxygen to interact with the air around the container. So, how do we meet that goal? And the answer to that is by choosing the proper ingredients. peat moss, shredded bark, coconut coir, soil, compost, manure, and then perlite, vermiculite, sand, all sorts of things. And these can be broken down into organic-based ingredients, so those that came from a living thing, that's going to be the peat, the bark, the core, the manure, and compost. And then inorganic components, like the perlite, the sand, and the soil. So first off, I just want to say, stay away from products that contain soil, because soil is not meant to be in containers, really. It's rarely uniform. It's easily compacted, which decreases the pore space, and decreased pore space is going to lead to a decreased rate of water and gas movement throughout the media. Soil also requires a higher watering frequency, and it's heavy, so it's hard to work with, and it can harbor disease, even if it has been sterilized. So if you must use a growing media that contains soil, make sure it's at a very low percentage of the mix.
How much?
Less than 10. So before I start talking about the different ratios of ingredients, I'd like to just kind of break each ingredient down, give you a little bit of info about it and the role that it plays in a growing media. So peat moss, shredded bark, and core are all very similar to each other. On the left picture is peat moss, the middle is bark, and then the right is core. So one thing about peat is that it is naturally acidic, and this helps plants uptake nutrients more efficiently. Both peat and core can hold up to 20 times their weight in water, so they have a very high water retention rate. And that's more than bark can. Bark can only hold about 15 times its weight in water. But bark has greater pore spaces, which are again going to allow for better gas and water movement throughout the media. But in a store-bought mix, it's going to be most common to find peat or core over bark, and that's because they tend to retain nutrients just a little bit better than bark does. Another common ingredient you may find is compost. And compost is great for adding to the soil in your garden, but it's really not recommended for your container gardens unless it's fully mature compost. If it's immature, it's going to harbor diseases likely, and pictured on the left is a fully mature compost, and on the right is an immature compost. So you can see why one would be acceptable to use in a container and one isn't. That immature compost, in addition to harboring disease, it's also just going to create inconsistencies throughout the container in terms of water and gas movement. Another ingredient you may find is manure. Manure is usually just used as a filler to cut down on production costs. You really want to stay away from it unless it has been fully composted. Raw manure, it can burn your plant roots, and it can also lead to ammonium buildup in the growing media, and that's going to be hard on your plants as well. So you all know what raw manure looks like, but then on the right is a composted manure. And again, you can see why one is more acceptable to use than the other. And so if you do find manure in a potting mix, again, at a low percentage. So those are the main organic-based ingredients that you'll find in a potting mix. And so now I want to move on to the inorganics. There is perlite and perlite and vermiculite, and their goal or their purpose in a potting mix is to increase that pore space. Again, that pore space is going to allow for drainage and nutrient retention. Perlite tends to be a little bit larger particles than vermiculite. They do not provide any additional nutrients for in the growing media. And one problem with them is that they can become very easily compacted. So you don't want too much perlite or vermiculite in a growing medium. And again, I will talk more about the specific ratios you want to look for in a little bit. Sand, again, is used as a filler. It doesn't provide any nutrients. It can increase the drainage, and so if you're looking for a faster draining potting mix, maybe you would want some sand mixed in there. And then finally, fertilizers. So there's both synthetic and organic based fertilizers. The synthetic fertilizers, that's going to be like Osmocote products or Miracle Grow, those types of things you can find at the store, that are the little pellets. And they can either be a slow release type, which slowly release nutrients over usually a 3-month period about, or a starter charge, which is a quick release of nutrients over just a few weeks. And then the organic-based fertilizers are going to be things like worm castings, or bone meal, or guano, blood meal, and then also compost will count as that as well. So now let's get into the ideal ratios. So it's considered that the best performing growing media have a 70 to 80% organic matter content. And so the organic matter is going to be that peat and core, maybe a little compost and shredded bark, but you want it to be primarily peat or core. And then the remaining components will be all inorganics, like that perlite or vermiculite. So you're probably wondering, well, how do I even know what is in a bag of potting mix at the store? And they almost all contain an ingredient list on the back of the package, as this one does here. Yeah. So this product is formulated from 45 to 55% peat moss, peat humus, perlite, worm castings, and some limestone to adjust pH. So they're usually going to list the percentage of the primary organic ingredient, which in this case is that peat moss, and we have a 45 to 55% range. So that's going to be a little bit on the lower end of what you're looking for. You probably want maybe a 60% peat moss, because this peat humus and worm castings are also going to add to the organic matter percentage. And if you're looking at different products at the store and you just can't find an ingredient list anywhere on the package, a good rule of thumb is that the heavier it is, the lower quality it is, because it contains lots of fillers like soil or sand, things like that. So, oh, yeah.
When they adjusted that pH and that, what did they adjust, what do they want it to, what pH would they want it to achieve?
Typically at 6 to 6.5 range.
In that bag?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So those are the ideal ratios, that 70 to 80% organic matter, and the remaining is inorganic matter. Let's talk about the different types of mixes that you can find at the store, and which ones are best for your containers. There's all-purpose mixes, specialty mixes, seed starting mixes, and then gardening soil. And any product labeled gardening soil is not meant for your containers. It's meant to be added to your outdoor garden. It typically is just fillers like topsoil or manure, and so it's a great addition to your outdoor garden, but not for your containers. And then different options among these different mixes are organic certified or non-organic certified, and that is a personal preference, as there's no difference really in performance between organic certified and not. So like one example you might want organic certified is if you're growing vegetables to harvest, maybe that's the case where you would want a fully organic mix. And then you can also get the option of those that contain a fertilizer already and those that do not. Some can just be the peat and perlite, for example, with no fertilizer. It's gonna be more common to find one that has fertilizer, and that's probably what you want anyway. It's gonna be more common to find a potting mix that already has fertilizer in it, and that you're probably gonna wanna go with a product like that just to provide some additional nutrients for your plants. So all-purpose mixes are meant for the general use for all plant types, and this is probably what you're gonna want in your containers, especially if you have multiple plant species in the same container. The main organic ingredient is usually peat or coir, and then primarily perlite for the inorganic component. Usually, in that 60 to 75% range of peat, and the remainder is perlite. And they often contain a slow-release fertilizer. And there's hundreds and hundreds of different brands of all-purpose mixes. But again, that's the type of mix you're probably going to want in your container. Seed starting mixes are similar in the way that they're meant for all plant types, but as the name implies, you really only want to use them for starting seeds because they're typically finer textured than an all-purpose mix, so they're going to compact over time, and they're just not going to have as great of water and gas exchange capabilities, and they contain vermiculite over perlite, and remember, vermiculite is going to be smaller particles, and you want those larger perlite particles. And they contain little to no fertilizer, and that's to promote root growth, to make the roots actively search for nutrients and develop quickly. So not a product you really want for your containers. And then specialty mixes. So these are going to be very specific for plant types, such as orchids or cacti or citrus trees. So unless you have those types of plants growing in your containers, you probably want to stay away from this. They have a specific pH and nutrient level, and they're just not going to serve the need that an all-purpose mix will. And then again, gardening soil, it's going to be very cheap and maybe tempting to bring home with you, but it's meant for adding to the outdoor garden, not for a container, because it contains topsoil, compost, manure, sand, and all the things you don't want in your container. So again, make sure to check the ingredient lists on whatever package you're looking at buying. It'll be a kind of a dead giveaway as to the quality of the product. For example, if you look at the package and it said it was 30% peat, or it contained raw manure, that'd be a big red flag. Put that back on the shelf. You don't want to take that home with you. But if it said it contained 75% peat and some fertilizer and perlite, that's probably something you'd want to take home with you. Again, the lower quality products will contain lots of fillers. So pretty much anything that contains more than one filler is a low quality product. And again, just because it's the most expensive doesn't necessarily mean it will have the best ingredients in it. So make sure to check that ingredient list. That ingredient list will also provide information as to whether or not any additional microbes or mycorrhizae were added. If you remember from that other picture of the ingredient list I had, it said additional mycorrhizae. And some packages will have just one additional strain, and others will have a dozen or more strains. And for that group, it's kind of the more the merrier. Yeah.
Percentages, are they by volume or weight? What's a typical?
By volume, usually. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the more mycorrhizae, the better. Usually, is a good rule to follow, as these are gonna have the potential to increase your root growth, help the plant take up nutrients better, which is just gonna help the plant be healthier and more vigorous, and a healthier plant can better fight off any potential diseases than a plant that isn't thriving. Alright, so now I want to do just kind of a brief little brand comparison. This was done by a gardener out in Michigan who specializes in container gardening, and he just wanted to compare what a very cheap product does to a kind of middle of the road product to a very expensive product. And so he compared New Plant Life which was $3 a bag, and then Miracle Grow, which is $8 a bag, and then Pro Mix, which was $11 a bag. And so he just wanted to look at what ingredients they contained, and then he transplanted tomatoes into these different medias to see how they affected plant growth after 3 weeks. So here's just some pictures as to what those products are. Very common. You can find them just about at any store, any gardening store. Again, the New Plant Life is going to be the cheapest, and Pro Mix the most expensive. And so his initial notes on these different mixes is that the New Plant Life contained a lot of topsoil and a lot of compost and sand with very little organic matter or perlite. So that's a big red flag. This is a low quality product, which is what you would expect for it being so cheap. It was also very dense and heavy, which indicates it'll probably become compacted pretty quickly. The Miracle Grow had a lot of organic matter, and that was mostly peat and core. It was a combination of the two, and perlite. And it had a pretty fine texture to it. And then finally, the Pro Mix had the finest texture of all, and the most organic matter, and it also had the largest perlite pieces. And that's important to note because the larger the perlite, the bigger the pore spaces are going to be. So, and I have pictures of what the plants look like on the next slide. After 3 weeks, looked at the plants, and in the New Plant Life container, which had become very compacted and was very heavy, the plant was healthy, it was alive, it was doing all right, but it wasn't very big. It was the smallest of the three. The Miracle Grow had maintained its lightweight and fluffiness, but there was some transplant shock in the plant, but the new growth was healthy and vigorous, and it was quite a bit larger than the New Plant Life. And then finally, the Pro Mix media had 2 times as much growth as the Miracle Grow plant, and it also maintained its lightweight, although because it was so fine textured, it was easily overwatered. And so yes, in this case, the most expensive product did do the best, but if it was being consistently overwatered, that might have not been the case. So even though you have a high quality product, as I said before, they're still going to have those pros and cons, so you need to keep those in mind that yes, it can be easily overwatered. And so here on the very left of the reddish pot is the New Plant Life. And you can see the plant it's fine, it's just not doing as well as the others. The Miracle Grow is in this blue pot, so you can see it's got quite a bit more growth than the New Plant Life. And then finally, the Pro Mix media here produced the largest, healthiest plant. And one thing I didn't mention is that none of these medias contained any fertilizer, so any additional fertilizer. So that was not a variable in this. And then one little media comparison I did here in the greenhouse is I wanted to look at not so much different brands, but different ratios of ingredients. And so I had 8 different mixes, and the first one is just straight sterilized soil, which I just wanted to do to kind of compare how the plant would look if it was planted in a garden. And you can see the plant is healthy, doing pretty well actually. And then the mix number 2 is if it is 100% peat, and that is bad because it's just too much organic matter. It's too fine textured, too easily overwatered. There's no pore space really. You can see that the plant is struggling compared to some of these other mixes. Mix number 3 was 25% peat and the rest was perlite. And so this is just too little organic matter. So we're going from too much to too little. So, and they're about the same size, and feel free to come up and look at these afterwards too. Probably this one seems to be doing the best, and it is 75% peat and 25% perlite. And it's got 2 more leaves than some of these others. And then this is in a germination mix, and so it's very fine textured, not a lot of pore space, and again, the plant is healthy, but not doing as well as some of the other mixes. This is the Pro Mix Soilless Potting Mix, so it's 75% peat, or 80% peat on 20% perlite, and it also has additional mycorrhizae. Perlite pieces aren't as large as the homemade mix here, that's 75% peat and 25% perlite. So I think that could be a reason that it's not doing as well as mix number 4. And then this potting mix here, it is the Sun Grow brand, which was 75% peat and 25% perlite. But the perlite particles, again, are very small, so it's pretty fine textured, easily overwatered. So even, and I was giving all of these containers the same amount of water every day, just to imitate, if these were outside and getting rainfall. Obviously, if they were in your containers and you knew you had a very fine textured mix that was going to be easily overwatered, you'd be a little more wary of that. And then this final mix I have, it's an organic certified Sunshine brand, and it is 75% peat and 25% perlite. Smallest perlite pieces of all. It's very fine textured, very easily overwatered, and so you can see that that's causing the plant some problem. So with the best one being these large perlite sizes, particles, and about 75% organic matter. So now I want to discuss how you might kind of pick a growing media if you have some specific goals in mind with your containers. For example, if you want fast and early growth right away in the summer, you don't really care if the plant kind of peters out later in the season, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you want a slower and steadier growth that lasts all season long. Other needs you might have is your watering frequency. Are you okay watering every day, or do you like to get out of town on the weekends and need to be able to leave your container 2 or 3 days without getting watered? And then in terms of fertilizing rate, are you okay fertilizing regularly throughout the whole season, or would you rather just not deal with it at all and whatever fertilizer is in the mix you buy is what it gets? And then do you want to spend maybe a little extra money in investing in that high quality mix where you don't have to do anything to maintain it really? Or do you feel adventurous and like to experiment and want to create your own to fit a specific need you might have? So for fast and early growth, you're going to want a higher organic to inorganic ratio than the 70 to 80% range, so maybe the 80 to 85% organic matter. You also want to avoid a product that contains a lot of organic fertilizers or organic based fertilizers, because as I said before, they kind of release nutrients slower. Yes, it's a longer supply, but if you're looking for that fast growth, you want a fertilizer that's going to quickly release nutrients. And so that might be via a starter charge, synthetic fertilizer, or a slow release fertilizer, or both. And even with those fertilizers in the media already, you're probably still gonna wanna start supplying additional fertilizer about 2 weeks after transplanting on a weekly basis. And you want that fertilizer to be high in nitrogen and phosphorus, because those nutrients promote foliage growth and flowering. So if you want the opposite, you want that slower growth but steady growth that lasts all season long, you're gonna want closer to even ratio of organic to inorganic matter. So that 65 to 70% organic matter range. And then you'll want those organic-based fertilizers that supply nutrients all season long. But it's still a good idea to fertilize on a bi-weekly basis instead of a weekly, and use a fertilizer that has a more even ratio of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It doesn't need to be super high in nitrogen or phosphorus. So in terms of watering rates, the higher the organic matter content, the better it's going to retain water. So you'll have to water less often then. Of course, you don't want to have too high of organic matter, as we saw in that one mix, as that kind of stunts the plant. And if you get too much organic matter, it has the potential to limit root growth just because it's so easily overwatered and it doesn't dry out. And so if you end up purchasing a mix and it just seems like it's too high in organic matter, one thing you can do is mix in some sand or maybe some perlite just to kind of increase that pore space and promote a little better drainage. For fertilizer rates, as you can guess by now, if you don't want to fertilize very frequently or at all, you're going to want a potting mix that contains organic-based fertilizers like worm castings and bone meal and compost. And then the more sources of fertilizer that are in a mix, so for example, if there's guano, bone meal, and compost in a mix, that's going to provide a wider array of nutrients and the container will require less fertilizing than if it just contained bone meal or just contained compost. And so generally, the cheaper a mix is, the less diverse its nutrient sources are going to be. But if you don't mind supplying additional fertilizer every week when you do waterings, then you don't need to worry about having as diverse of a source of nutrients. And then purchasing in a mix versus making your own. If you want something, you can just buy it at the store, come home, put it in your container, put your plants in it, and call it good, and not have to worry about it the rest of the season. It's probably worth investing in that higher quality mix that has that more diverse source of ingredients. Then it's a one and done deal, and you don't really have to mess with it. But as I said, if you are feeling adventurous or like to experiment, you can create your own, either completely from scratch or by purchasing a lower quality mix and just adding to it, such as adding more peat to increase the organic matter percentage. That might be one way you can maybe save a few dollars, or adding more fertilizer to it, things like that. And if you wanted to completely create your own from scratch, like let's say you were going to have a certain plant type in your containers, and you've done a little research and you know that they want a 60% organic matter and they're very sensitive to this type of fertilizer or something, and you just had specific requirements for that plant that you just couldn't find in a potted mix. That might be a scenario where you want to create your own and you can get those ideal ratios. And so if you don't really have any specific goals, if you just, for your containers, just kind of, whatever happens, happens. A good rule, these are some good rules to remember. The more organic matter, the better, up to a certain point, of course, probably nothing over 85%, as you can see what too high of organic matter does. And avoid the fillers like soil, sand, and manure, are probably just gonna cause you problems down the road. And the mix should always be light and fluffy. You don't want it to be heavy or dense. Remember, the heavier a product is, the lower quality it is. And the larger the perlite or vermiculite pieces are, the better the mix is, because it has that larger pore space and to promote that water and air exchange throughout the entire media. And then if you can find it as an option, those mixes that contain mycorrhizae or additional microbes are going to be your best bet, and just because they are going to promote that root growth and nutrient uptake. Alright, so now I'd like to kind of just discuss some general tips for container gardening. So let's start prior to transplanting. First off, when you're picking out your plants, try to pick plants that already have some known resistance to disease, as that might save you trouble down the road when you get a disease outbreak and it's too late. There's nothing you can do to save your plants. And always clean your containers thoroughly before using them. Use a 10% bleach solution, and that'll kill off any bad bacteria or fungal spores that are in the containers from previous years. When choosing a container, keep in mind that plastic containers are going to use less water than a clay or a fiber pot, so you probably want that plastic container unless, of course, you need a fast draining soil for your plant type. Then maybe you'd want to go with a fiber or a clay pot. And if you end up in a situation where you're going to be using 2 or more types of potting media, like let's say you just have a few open bags in your garage and you just want to use them up and get rid of them, make sure to mix them together thoroughly before you put them in your containers. If you just layer them in there, there'll be layered differences of how quickly the water drains, how well the roots can get through it, things like that. And then as you fill your container, make sure to pack down the media, but don't pack it too tight that you're kind of squeezing out all that pore space. And always water it in very thoroughly, saturate it, just because it's probably going to settle.
Excuse me?
Mm-hmm.
If I winter my annuals and keep it at 45 degrees in my playhouse, now my question for you is, I do not replace the dirt every year. I usually do it every 2 years and then add fertilizer to it in between. Am I doing it right?
So you usually don't want to reuse it year after year, just because that will allow for diseases to build up and it really kind of depletes the soil. So one thing you can do, obviously you don't want to just throw it away and waste it, right? So if you compost at home or anything, it can be added to that and then used again once that compost is mature. And so you can kind of cycle through it, you know, one year it's in the compost and the next year it's in, and that way you'll always have a batch in your compost and a batch in your containers.
So you would recommend every year changing it then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Changing all the soil?
Yep. Yep. All right. So some tips for after you've transplanted your flowers into it. You should begin fertilizing with a water-soluble fertilizer on a bi-weekly basis, about 2 to 3 weeks after transplanting. So with water-soluble fertilizers, you always want to fertilize the growing media, not the plant itself, as getting it on the foliage can burn the leaves of the plant. Again, if you don't want to be fertilizing on a regular basis, make sure to choose a mix that has that more diverse source of organic-based fertilizers in them. Or that same time, the plants can be pinched, just kind of pinch off the top few nodes to promote a bushier and kind of more lush plant. When you go to water, only water when the top 2 inches of the media is dry. Otherwise, can be easily overwatered, and when that happens, you're going to drown the roots, and that'll be bad for your plant. And then, one thing to keep in mind, when fertilizing or when choosing a fertilizer to apply, that nitrogen is going to promote foliage growth, phosphorus promotes flowering, and potassium promotes seed development. So over the course of the season, the plant's needs change. You know, at first they need a lot of nitrogen, then they need more phosphorus than they were needing before, and then more potassium. All right, so now it's the end of the season. You had great looking containers because you chose the good quality potting mix, you fertilized and watered regularly, and you prevented disease, so congratulations. But the work is not done yet. Don't reuse potting mix every year, as I said before. They can harbor disease. Instead, use them in your compost, and within a year or so, they'll be ready to be used again. Sanitize your garden tools and containers at the end of the season, again, just to prevent some disease. And then also jot down some notes of what worked well for you and what didn't. For example, if you use 2 or 3 different potting mixes in different containers, keep track of which one worked best, so that you know to buy that product again next year. You don't want to end up making the same mistake 2 years in a row just because you forgot what happened. Other notes, if you had made your own or had added certain types of fertilizers, or were using a new brand of fertilizer than you have used in the past, just kind of keep track of how they perform, because we all say that we will remember what we did in the spring, but we know that doesn't always happen. So, in summary of kind of my presentation and the key takeaways here is to always read the ingredient list on the back of the package. It's going to give you any red flags if it's got a lot of fillers in it, or it doesn't really have a diverse source of nutrients. And remember, the goal you're looking to do is to optimize that oxygen, water, and nutrient availability. So in order to do that, the product needs to be light and fluffy with large pore spaces. So you want those large perlite particles. And you also want a diverse source of fertilizers. And that's going to go a long way. And then finally, disease prevention is a lot easier than trying to cure a disease. Because usually by the time you notice a disease, it might be too late. And so, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I'll open it up to any questions. All right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, to space them in the container?
For example, tomato plants, you put
So,
closer than you would in a garden, or what?
not really, because you don't want them to become overgrown with each other, because that's going to be how diseases spread between the plants. So when you're transplanting them and trying to decide how to space them, think of how big they're going to be when they're fully mature, and you don't want too much overlap between mature plants. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Any special thoughts or tricks on tulips in containers?
I do.
They fail every year.
I've never grown tulips in containers. No, sorry. Has anyone else?
I'm trying this year, but I did it chill rather than chill
know, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. Yeah.
Question.